Hey everyone, welcome back to Quick Question Pastor, the podcast where I take some of your questions and just work through them. The goal of this is to be conversational. I don't have an entire script written out, but truly my goal, my purpose is to interact with questions that you may ask on a week to week basis. I want to start by saying I'm sorry for the hiatus. A lot of you have been asking when and if I was going to get back to this. And my goal here is to at least do every other week. If I have time on a more regular basis, I will try to do it a little bit more often than that. But my goal will be every other week. And this last Sunday, I was asked a question that after church that I think is a good jumping off point to discussing something on maybe a bit of a larger scale. And so, if you were at church on Sunday, we looked at Mark chapter 5 and starting in verse 21. And so, if you're in a place where you could pull up a Bible, I encourage you to do that. I'm going to be referencing this passage a lot. But the question I was asked, oh, before I forget, sorry about this. Like I said, I don't have a script written out. With us getting back to this, if there are questions that I did not get to before when I was doing this more regularly, feel free to send those back and say, hey, don't forget this one. I don't want to miss anything. So feel free to do that and I will get to them. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. The question I was asked was um, about the end of the passage. It says Jesus instructed that they would give the little girl that he just raised from the dead something to eat. And the person that asked me this question said that I left out that detail. I didn't talk about it much or at all in the sermon. And the person said that one of the things I've said throughout this series in particular, but it's true throughout the Bible. Typically, Mark, though, he doesn't give a lot of details, and when he does give a detail, especially if it looks odd or is noteworthy or seemingly noteworthy, um, then it's important. There's a reason Mark was giving that detail, and so why does Mark end with that, and what does it mean? So here's what I want to do. If you look at Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21, we see the story of Jairus and his daughter. And in the middle of that, we see the story of the woman that had bleeding. And what I want to look at is this person's question, but I want to take it from a bit of a step back perspective. Um, if you follow along, especially when we have a little bit longer of a passage, now, I mean, in every sermon, there are details, there are things that do not make it to the sermon, that there are things that are left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. In fact, I have a pastor friend. He used to have his own podcast where the whole purpose of the podcast was every week he would get on, he would talk through the things that didn't make it into the sermon, because one of the hardest things to do in sermon prep is actually deciding what not to say. Every Sunday, I have a lot more things I could say, could talk about. There's more connections to other passages in the Bible. There's other things that are happening. There are details that I don't quite dive into. But if we did that every Sunday, I would have to start bringing in lunch and maybe even dinner. Like that could last a long, long time. So, what I want to do today is I want to look at this passage with that kind of lens, answering that question specifically about the girl and why Jesus said, "Give her something to eat." But I also want to look at other parts of this passage that weren't mentioned, uh, because when what I've said repeatedly, Mark and the other writers in the Bible, they are writing with an agenda. They are trying to communicate something. And every Sunday when I go up there to preach, my one of my goals, I also have an agenda, and one of my goals is to teach the text accurately and clearly. I want to honor the Lord and His Word, um, but there are times where certain details just I don't have the chance or the time to mention them, or they don't serve even the main point necessarily. They could still serve the main point, but I'm trying not to distract too much either with other details or whatever it may be. So here are some of the things from Sunday that I didn't quite get to. Some of them are interesting, some of them are more than interesting, and things that are quite significant. But I want to start with one kind of lower tier, doesn't add a lot to the story, but one of the things we mentioned is this sandwich structure. Verses 21 through the beginning of 24, we have the story of Jairus coming to Jesus and saying, "My daughter is dead, or not dead, my daughter is sick. She's almost dead. Jesus, please come heal her." And then there's this interruption where this woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, we read that in verse 25, and she touches the Jesus garments and she's healed immediately. And then verse 35, after she's healed, Jairus finds out that his daughter has died, and then we pick it back up with that story, and Jesus goes and raises her from the dead, and it's a really cool story. But there's a detail that on Sunday I didn't quite mention. The detail is the little girl is 12 years old, and the woman, and we find out she's 12 in verse 42. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. But we also see back in verse 25, there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Now, we're not going to build an entire doctrine or view on a certain theological topic because the woman had this condition for 12 years and the little girl was 12 years old. The purpose of those details is, remember I said that one of the things that a sandwich structure does is we're supposed to see the symmetry, the things that are similar in the stories, in order to help us see the things that are different. And that number 12 is just Mark re-emphasizing, just look how similar these stories are. They both deal with the number 12, with a 12-year timeline. So minor thing, I didn't throw that in there on Sunday, but it's still interesting. It still adds to the passage. Another thing that I didn't quite get to is when verse 28, for she said, if I even touch his garments, we're talking about the woman with the blood issue, I will be made well. Verse 29 says, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself the power had gone out from him, immediately turned to the crowd and said, who has touched my garments? And the verse I didn't mention too much was verse 31. And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. So the disciples ask, I think, a fair question. If we were in this crowd that was pressing in and trying to figure out, and someone gets touched, and one of the people's like, someone touched me, you'd look around and be like, well, yeah, someone touched you. I bet 30 people have touched you in the last 5 seconds. I bet a dozen people have touched you since you asked that question. Why are you asking who touched you? And what we see here is the disciples are looking literally like, what do you mean who touched you? Everyone here is pressing in and making physical contact. But Jesus is, and we talked about this for a bit on Sunday, Jesus is responding to not just Jairus, but also this woman with the blood issue. He's responding to their faith. So the disciples, they don't fully understand Jesus yet. We see that, we've seen that in stories before this. We saw this with the storm, the calming of the storm. They don't quite understand Jesus. And so when Jesus says, who touched me? Their minds don't jump to spiritual truth. They don't jump to faith. Their minds jump immediately to physical reality. What do you mean, who touched you? But Jesus is like, no, I don't mean who physically touched me. I'm asking who in faith reached out to me. And I mean, that go back to having an agenda. That does speak directly to what the main point, things I was talking about on Sunday. But ultimately, either time constraints or whatever have you, a passage that is over 20 verses long, or am I right about that? Yeah, over 20 verses long. I just can't touch every detail, but we see that there's this moment that speaks directly to the issue at hand. Jesus is responding to faith, and the disciples don't quite get that yet. Um, and then another thing, it says, verse 32, he looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him. And here's the line that I didn't quite touch on, and told him the whole truth. We have no idea what all she said. It doesn't tell us what she said. I think we can reasonably guess what she said. She told him that I have had this bleeding issue for 12 years, and it makes me ceremonially unclean. And so I'm the one that touched you because I was looking for healing. And Jesus responded the way he responded, called her daughter, faith has made her well, and the things that we talked about. Her telling the whole truth, Jesus was inviting this woman into a real relationship with him. He's not just, hey, let's get you healed and move on. He wants this woman to be one of his people. So her speaking openly and honestly is her responding to the invitation of Jesus. Him saying, tell me who did this. Her saying, here's why I did this. Here's who I am. That's her responding in an amazing way in faith. On Sunday, I used an analogy, and I said that sitting in a chair, if you don't believe the chair is going to hold you, that has no impact on if the chair is actually going to hold you. Or if you sit in a chair that's busted, a chair that doesn't have strong legs, and you think you have all the confidence in the world that it's totally going to keep you upright, that has no bearing on if it's actually going to. The strength is not in the faith in and of itself. The strength is in the object of our faith. And so this woman has faith the size of a mustard seed. I'm going to reach out to Jesus and touch him. And Jesus responds to that faith by inviting her to more than just physical healing. He's responding to her and inviting her to restoration, inviting her to relationship. And she responds by doing just that. And so when we think about spreading the gospel to people, we're not simply just, hey, let's get you saved, make sure you're going to heaven and not hell, and then move on with our lives. We want to invite people into the transforming relationship with Christ. Jesus is so much more than a just get out of hell free card. Um, when we limit him to that, we're really robbing the gospel. The transformation, the transforming power, the transformation that happens inside of us, the indwelling of the Spirit, are the ability, the opportunity we have to serve and love one another and those outside of the church. And so her faith is welcomed by Jesus and then invited to grow to a true relationship with Christ. And so it's the same invitation to us. And the question is will we respond, or will we keep our faith in the same small place? I want to look at the question I was actually asked. Let's go all the way down to the end of the passage. And here's what it says. The little girl, I say to you, arise, verse 42. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. And I didn't talk much about the give her something to eat, but I want to look at this holistically. So the little girl is dead. The woman had a discharge of blood for 12 years. If you read the Old Testament law, both of those circumstances, both of those conditions, if you will, would mean that that person is unclean. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday, that that woman who had the discharge of blood, if she would have touched someone, it's not that she would have gotten their cleanliness. She actually would have given them her uncleanliness. She would have made them unclean. So by Jesus allowing her to touch him, by Jesus reaching out and touching this little girl, he's he's actually doing something that wasn't done. But this is an important difference between Jesus and anybody else. Um, when someone who was unclean touched a person who was clean, they made the unclean person made the clean person unclean. Uncleanliness is what was spread. But when Jesus comes, we can't give him our uncleanliness. He gives us his cleansing power. He spreads righteousness, he spreads holiness. And so it's not just that Jesus is bringing healing, he's also utterly, radically transforming these two people. But he doesn't just have power. It's not just, oh, look at the power of Christ and look that he can raise the dead and look that he can stop this bleeding issue. He restores them and he humanizes them. And he treats them like they're precious and like they're people. And he has this tenderness and this care. We see it with the woman with the blood issue. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." He's restoring her. "Daughter, you are now part of the community. You're part of my people." And then we have this moment with this little girl. Get up. And she does. And everyone's amazed. The disciples just watched a little girl get raised from the dead. Immediately, everyone's overcome with amazement. Her dad, you can imagine this man who was so desperate and went to Jesus and said, "Heal my little girl, please." Jesus is like, "Here's your daughter." And the story, like there's this, it builds and builds. We talked about this on Sunday a bit. The story's building, and then there's your daughter's dead, and it like comes to a screeching halt, but then he heals her and it like picks up steam again. And there's this amazing momentum being built. And the story ends with, "Hey, you should get her lunch." That's it's borderline, if not just outright, anticlimactic. The story kept building and building, and then, hey, she needs lunch. And this does a few things. One, it shows that this isn't a metaphor or a myth that Mark is doing to teach us something grand without by using a parable, using something that didn't actually happen. Mark is showing that this is a real story, that this little girl was dead and now she's alive. Because I don't know about you, I love to sit down with people for a meal, for lunch. I love to have people over for dinner. I love to get together with people. I've never gotten together with a dead person for a meal. And so by Jesus saying, uh, "Give her some food," he's saying she's actually alive. This isn't this isn't a trick. This isn't a metaphor. She's really, really alive. And Jesus cares for her as a person. And he's restoring her. And part of restoration for this case is he's putting her back into normal, everyday family life. Hey, you were dead. You were no longer going to participate with your parents, with your family, with your friends in normal, everyday things. But now that you're alive, hey, have a meal. Share food with one another. Break bread. One of the most common things across all cultures and all time that people, one of our shared experiences, one of our communal experiences is to eat together. And we see this, that the family's amazed in this moment. And I've emphasized this in previous miracles in the the book of Mark. I have when I've preached some John as well. But we often see when Jesus does something, there are people who respond in amazement. And this detail should lead us to amazement. It should lead us to, wow, not only did Jesus raise her from the dead, which is awesome, he's restoring her back to her family. Look how much he cares for her. He wants to give her some food. He wants her to be a part of normal human life. Not only does he have authority over death and disease, he also has tender compassion towards people. And that's true for me and you as well. He's not simply just giving us forgiveness. He's inviting us into relationship, and he's restoring us to peace with God and peace with one another. And we should respond like others, like they do in verse 42. We should be overcome with amazement, with awe, with wonder, with worship, by looking at Christ and being like, did this for me too. I've never physically been dead. He has not physically raised me from the dead, but he spiritually raised me from the dead. I was dead in my sins, and Jesus raised me from the dead. He forgave me, gave me grace, covered me with his blood. He rose from the grave, bringing me out of it with him. And not only did he do that, he restored me, and he cares for me. He cares and provides for my needs, and um, he's a tender and loving and gracious Savior. He's not just almighty, all powerful, all knowing. He's also all compassionate and all tender and all caring. And that's really beautiful news. So those are a few of the things that I didn't quite get to this last Sunday. And again, I don't want you to mishear me. It's not I'm not choosing between more important and lesser important things. Um, it's some of it is just the process of putting together a sermon. If we were to do either a Sunday school class, small group, or some more formal seminar teaching where we are truly going through line by line, then we would touch on each one of these things. If you were with us for the Genesis series, there were plenty of times where there were details here and there where we didn't quite get to, because some of those stories are really long, and so just don't quite have the time to do it. And so I love that kind of question. That kind of question. If there are things where when I'm preaching, you're like, hey, there's a little detail there that sticks out to me, doesn't seem to quite made it to the sermon. Um, hey, can you talk about that a little bit? Could you touch on that sometime in the future? Um, that's a great question, and that's what that actually, one of the things that says is, hey, I was paying attention to the text, I was following along, and this wasn't quite mentioned. I would love to hear more about it. And so I appreciate that question. Would love to get that question even more about future passages, because spoiler alert, that will not be the last time I do not, or that I miss a detail, or not miss a detail, that I don't quite get to a detail in a story or a passage, or whatever it may be. There are times where the detail might not even be in the story. It might be, or in that passage, it might be, hey, you didn't quite talk about this, but there's this line, and you did talk about that line and what it means. But is this connected to this other passage? You didn't mention that. Because there's a lot of passages in the Bible that are connected to other passages. And I mean, if we spent Sunday mornings talking about every connection for every verse that's connected elsewhere, that would really that would take a really long time. Sorry if you heard that ding. But yeah, I think that's a good place to stop, a good way to wrap up this first episode back. Please submit your questions. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with you, and I look forward to seeing you prayerfully, Lord willing, this Sunday in worship. God bless.